Hello dear students, this is Dr. Sangeeta Jain, Department of English, DAV PG College. Today, I'll speak about A House for Mr. Biswas by V.S. Naipaul. A House for Mr. Biswas is a seminal text of Caribbean literature. Now, what is Caribbean literature? Caribbean literature addresses the literature of the various territories of the Caribbean region, especially the former British West Indies, earlier referred to as Anglo-Caribbean or West Indian literature. That means earlier it was known as West Indian literature, but now that term is not used. The term is used which is Caribbean literature and which is part of new literatures in English. So why Caribbean literature is a group of, or it includes literatures from various nations in Caribbean. Caribbean territories, they are now independent nations since the 1960s. These Caribbean nations, they share a number of political, cultural and social bonds apart from one lingua franca, that is English language. On account of sharing many features like political, cultural, social, altogether, completely, literary critics consider their literary output in a single category called Caribbean literature. Which are these Caribbean countries? Colombia, Cuba, Dominica, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, Nicaragua, Panama, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Tobago and Trinidad, and many others. There are almost 21 to 22 Caribbean countries. For us, Trinidad is a Caribbean country, and this is important because this is the birthplace of Naipaul and this forms the setting of the novel. That is. But first, let's have some information about V.S. Naipaul. V.S. Naipaul was born in Trinidad in 1932 and departed for heavenly abode in 2018. He went to England on a scholarship in 1950. After 4 years at University College, Oxford, he began to write and since then has followed no other profession. He has published more than 30 books of fiction and non-fiction, including Half Alive, A Bend in the River, The Mask of Africa, The Mimic Man, and a collection of correspondence, letters between a father and son, among others. In 2001, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. Naipaul has written about this novel, that is A House for Mr. Biswas, is my most influential piece of fiction, and it is the book for which I am best known. Let's have some information about A House for Mr. Biswas. A House for Mr. Biswas was published in 1961. Now, what is the setting of the fiction? The setting of the fiction is the microcosm of Trinidad. That means the setting is of Trinidad. Teju Kole, in the introduction to the novel, highlights this point that Trinidad is an important island in the Caribbean, but not an influential one on the world stage. And it gave V.S. Naipaul an entire world of experience and feeling on which he has drawn the world of the novel. And even Naipaul himself has stated that the fabrication that came easily rested on the profound knowledge of the social structure I had grown up with. That means Naipaul has utilized the social structure in which he has grown up as the setting of the novel. So the setting of the novel is the society of the Trinidad. Now, if he utilizes his personal experience of the place, culture of Trinidad, that means the novel or the narrative has some autobiographical elements. Now, so we can call it an autobiographical narrative. Naipaul has modeled the protagonist, Mr. Biswas, after his father, Sri Prasad Naipaul. Sri Prasad Naipaul was a journalist himself and he inspired Naipaul to become a writer. In fact, Naipaul himself has written about it in the afterword. The book though autobiographical in one way, is in the profoundest way a work of the imagination. That means he has utilized his memories of his father, but he has infused it with his imaginative realm. Now we can say how beautifully he has weaved the memory of the misfortunes of his father's life with creative and artistic elements to shape the novel. Naipaul's father was an East Indian who struggled to make a life for his family, just as Mr. Biswas in the narrative struggles. So Naipaul's father was an East Indian and he struggled a lot, and Naipaul has modeled Mr. Biswas's character on his own father. So this novel is an existential novel written in picaresque tradition. The novel deals with the existential crisis of an individual. The novel deals with an existential crisis of an individual who is in search of freedom, independence, quest for his essence as a human being, trying to give meaning to his life, living passionately, sincerely, and authentically. He doesn't bother about the imposed labels and roles. He is always seeking freedom, liberty, and independence. Just like the protagonist of a picaresque fiction, the protagonist of this narrative is also a wandering individual of low standing who faces a series of adventures among people of various classes, relying on his own sense of judgment. So we can say this is an existential novel written in picaresque tradition. Now we come to the plot of the narrative. What is the plot of the narrative? A novel of epic length. This is a long novel, almost more than 500 pages. A novel of epic length has an episodic plot. So there are many episodes. There are no chapters, but rather episodes from the life of Mr. Biswas. So now this novel has epic length, has episodic plot, which is basically a saga of conflicts of a ruthless man by an omniscient narrator. Narrator is omniscient and who is enfolding the episodes of Mr. Biswas's life like a CCTV camera. Like a CCTV camera. Now, Mr. Biswas, who is Mr. Biswas and what is his belief? That is, so the plot revolves around it. Mr. Biswas has an earnest desire of having a titular house in Trinidad. So he has an earnest desire of having his own house. The narrative unfolds his odyssey of struggles in order to fulfill his dream of owning a house. This is a journey of struggles of Mr. Biswas's life to fulfill his dream of having his own house. The reason why he wants to have his own house, everybody wants to have his own house. Be it in India or anywhere in the world, they want their own house. Now the reason he tells is the existential crisis he suffers after roaming from one house to another house without having a small land which he can call his own. So he says, to have lived without even attempting to lay claim to one's portion of the earth. To have lived and died as one had been born, unnecessary and unaccommodated. Mr. Biswas thinks that if he doesn't have his own house, he would live as well as die. His life was and is unnecessary and unaccommodated anywhere in the world. So he doesn't want to die. He doesn't want to die without a portions of earth, without having his own house. That is. So now we come to the character of Mr. Biswas. The prologue. The prologue encapsulates the whole narrative. That means the whole story has been summarized in the prologue. The prologue encapsulates the whole narrative and at the very outset introduces Mr. Biswas, the protagonist, and the money he owed on his house very plaintively. This is a quotation. 10 weeks before he died, Mr. Mohan Biswas, a journalist of Sikkim history, St. James, port of Spain, was sacked. He was removed from the job. Mr. Biswas was 46 years old and had 4 children. He had no money. His wife Shama had no money. That means they were poor. On the house in Sikkim Street, Mr. Biswas owed and had been owing for 4 years $3,000. The interest on this at 8% came to $20 a month. Whether he was able to pay it or not, we don't know. It was not written. 2 children were at a school. The 2 older children were both abroad on scholarship. This is the first paragraph of the prologue, which narrates or unfolds who was Mr. Biswas, what is the age of Mr. Biswas, and how many children he has. And the 2 lines which are very important: he had no money, his wife Shama had no money. That is. So Mr. Biswas, as his name suggests, is a symbol of faith in the triumph of human spirit. Biswas, that means Vishwas, that means faith. So Mr. Biswas, as his name suggests, is a symbol of faith in the triumph of human spirit. He is a congenital, unlucky man from birth until his untimely death, 46 years later. He mostly lives in a series of houses of relatives and in-laws, from Hanuman House to the Chase to Greenvale to Short Hills to a rental in Port of Spain. These residences are mere walls and roofs to him. These residences are not his own residences. So these residences seemed to him mere walls and roofs. There was no freedom, there was no liberty, there was no security. The tragedy is that none of the house is for Mr. Biswas. So his overarching mission of life is to have a house of his own. That was the character of Mr. Biswas. Now there are other characters also. In fact, it is a microcosm and macrocosm of many characters. There are many characters. A number of characters are there. Mr. Biswas's parents are there. His wife Shama and 4 children. Shama's mother, Mrs. Tulsi. Mrs. Tulsi's all sons and daughters, their husbands, wives and children, and relatives of both the families, neighbors, lawyers, assistants, etc. The important thing is houses have their own names, and there's a beautiful description of furniture. It looks as if the houses as well as the furniture, because of the description of the furniture and all the paraphernalia of the house, it looks as if the houses with names and furniture, they are also characters in the narrative, where house is the central metaphor. It has been used in the title also, a house for Mr. Biswas. Now, house is the central metaphor. House is one of the primary needs of human beings, roti, kapda or makan. We all know that every individual needs roti, kapda or makan, that is bread, clothes and shelter. So this is the basic need. The basic need is house. So house, now what is the meaning of the house? What is the meaning of the house? House demonstrates that this is a self-contained world, a small world. Without house, what happens? Without house, one feels rootlessness. One feels lack of stability. One feels lack of privacy. One feels lack of close bonding. That means no bonding is there among members of the house. Lack of security and safety also. If we do not live in our own houses, there is lack of security and safety, and always there is a tension at the back of the mind that you have to pay the rent. That is, and somewhere or other your landlord will turn you out anytime. And if you don't have your own house, that means you don't have social dignity and respect also. And if you don't have your own house, that means you don't have freedom and independence in others' house. You cannot exercise the kind of liberty which you exercise at your own home. And in post-colonial writing, like this narrative, house demonstrates the decadence of the colonial power. That if you're having your own house, that symbolizes the decadence of the colonial power, culture, and the sustainability of local cultures. Now, what are the themes of this narrative? The thematic concerns. So, this quest of Mr. Biswas to find his own house is an individual's quest for stability, independence, and liberty. It is a searching discovery of privacy. Running from family, drudgery, and fate is the crux of Mr. Biswas's struggles, and his need to find a sense of belonging in a place and social group drives his quest for his own house. Mr. Biswas's family is the family of indentured laborers in a foreign land. How an immigrant and his future generations feel rootless, not only geographically and culturally, but emotionally, moving from one house to another in search of one permanent accommodation. So this is the major theme of the narrative. In this way, the major theme of the narrative is to find one's own house, and that symbolizes individual's quest for stability, independence, and liberty. There is another theme. This other theme is quest for identity and dignity. Mr. Biswas, he's always in search of, tries to find out his own identity. He's always in search of his own dignity. Born to illiterate peasants in rural Trinidad, Mr. Biswas is obsessed with social hierarchy and constantly worries about how he fits into it. He feels very happy when he enters initially Tulsi's house after marriage. His demands for respect and attention usually fall on deaf ears, especially within the Tulsi family. But his career as a journalist and government welfare agent in Port of Spain finally grant him the status he has always sought, despite achieving success through hard work and self-improvement. However, Mr. Biswas does not abandon his faith in outward symbols of status. He wanted to enhance his status, so throughout his life it has been shown that he was trying to occupy the material things of life, including house, which ultimately contributes to his downfall. Now, another theme is anti-colonialism. An underlying theme in A House for Mr. Biswas is anti-colonialism. This novel is a symbolic representation of the colonial experience. The Tulsis represent the Great Britain and Mr. Biswas represents the colonized people. His struggles for independence and freedom represent the struggle of colonized nations. His struggle, Mr. Biswas's struggles represent the struggle of the colonized nations for political, cultural, and social autonomy. Now, another major theme is immigration and the condition of indentured laborers in the colonized world. Now, what is this indentured labor? Indentured labor was a system of bonded labor that was instituted following the abolition of slavery. Indentured laborers were recruited to work on sugar, cotton, and tea plantations and rail construction projects in British colonies in West Indies, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Naipaul's forefathers, they also went there. They also went to Trinidad as indentured laborers. The novel depicts the immigrants' families during colonial period who went there as indentured laborers to work in different fields at various locations in the colonized world. These migrant laborers and their second and third generations find themselves rootless in foreign lands. Finally, because the first generation was working, the second generation and third generation, they felt problems. They couldn't understand whether they were belonging to that nation. That means either they were belonging to Trinidad or they were belonging to India, like in the case of V.S. Naipaul. V.S. Naipaul has very poignantly portrayed a few Indian immigrant workers' lives in Trinidad and their future generations' rootlessness, because he himself felt rootless. He couldn't he couldn't relate either to Trinidad, because by personality or by look, he looked like an Indian, and he, even in order to find his roots, he came to India because he belonged to Gorakhpur. It is stated like this. So he couldn't understand that whether he belonged to India or Trinidad. So this created a hybrid identity. Finally, Mr. Biswas finally becomes the owner of a house. But later he finds the shortfalls of the house. He buys a house of his own, and he owes a lot of money to repay. He owes a lot of money to pay, and later on he finds the shortfalls of the house. It was a degenerating house. Later on, after a few days after starting, when he started living in that house, he finds that it was a degenerating house. Having a house of his own finally grants him a piece of land, but the deteriorating house also symbolizes his collapsing relationship with his son, daughter, his in-laws, and relatives. He is literally a winner and a winner of material objects of life and a loser of wrong relationships. The narrative represents life as an existential dilemma. The narrative represents life as an existential dilemma. Finally, the novel portrays the existential dilemma of a poor dying man who collected the material possessions throughout his life to create a separate, private, independent life, and finally kept on waiting for the return of his son. Shama, his wife, and his daughter Savi supported him till his untimely death from heart attack. Naipaul writes about the inspiring idea of the book because he has created this novel on the basis of the memories of the struggles of his father and how he could achieve everything in his life. So Naipaul has written, the idea for the book was simple. A dying man considers the few physical objects which he has accumulated during his life and by which he is now surrounded. Perhaps comfortingly, now he sees all around that so many material things he has collected. A lot of description is there. So, by which he is now surrounded, perhaps comfortingly. He reflects on the history of each object, and so his life at the end is reduced to these few physical objects, rather than a network of relationships. He doesn't build a network of relationships. He builds all around him materialistic things of life. Thank you so much. If you have any questions or you have feedback, kindly send it drsjain191@gmail.com. Thank you.